involves that game of pharma. What was pharma thinking? Why was it so obsessed with making sure that we all took the so-called vaccines that were on offer? Why was it so obsessed with making sure that we didn't take the alternative repurposed drugs that so many doctors claimed were highly effective?
As treatments.
Right. Ivermectin,
Yes.
hydroxychloroquine, these things were demonized, and we were told not to take them, and we were mocked if we distrusted that advice. So the question is, what was all that? Why would that have happened? And again, this is not certain, but what I've pieced together is that pharma owned what was potentially the biggest pharmacological cash cow conceivable. It owned a beautiful technology, and I mean that sincerely, something truly brilliant, that would potentially not only allow a bright future from the perspective of creating new treatments and new, I hesitate to use the word vaccine because it doesn't really apply, but new vaccine-like technologies, but that it could do this indefinitely into the future, and it could allow you to reformulate every vaccine currently on the market. And what's more, the property in question would allow this whole process to be streamlined at an incredible level, because effectively all you needed was a sequence, a genetic sequence from a pathogen, and you could literally type it into a machine and produce a vaccine that was already in use, but for the swapping out of the antigen in question.
So it was like Legos.
Yeah, it's exactly like Legos. And presumably with some justification, to the extent that this technology was safe, pharma would be able to argue, well, we don't really need to go through thorough safety testing of the entire platform each time we deploy it. All we need to do is figure out if the antigen that we've loaded in this time is in some way more dangerous than the last one. The problem, so that the technology in question is the mRNA transfection platform, which was wrongly in this case called a vaccine. And it is ingenious. It solves a really important problem from gene therapy, which is oftentimes you want to get the body to do something. Let's say that you are missing a functional copy of a gene that produces some product like insulin that you need. Well, you could take insulin, or it would be great if we could convince your body to produce the product itself like a healthy person does. Very hard to do that, though, because the body is composed in adult humans 30 trillion cells or so. So how do you get cells to take up the message and produce enough of the product to matter? Well, the mRNA technology allows you to induce cells to take up an mRNA message, which they will then automatically transcribe. And it does this by encapsulating these messages in lipid nanoparticle. Lipid just means fat. And you may remember from basic chemistry, like attracts like dissolves like. And so these fats get taken up by cells very regularly for simple chemical reasons. And then the message gets transcribed, and voila, you've gotten cells to produce something that they didn't know how to produce in the first place. Useful for vaccine-like technology, useful for curing deficiencies. The problem, however, is that this amazing technology, which it's very hard to estimate how much money pharma might have made from it. I think hundreds of billions of dollars is absolutely certain. Trillions of dollars is not off the table, given that this would allow patentable drugs to be produced indefinitely into the future. But the technology itself has a terrible safety flaw that, in my opinion, never would have gotten through even the most cursory safety tests. And that flaw is that there's no targeting of the lipid nanoparticles. The lipid nanoparticles will be taken up by any cell they encounter. And while that's not perfectly random, it will be haphazard around the body. Now, if they were limited, if they simply stayed in the injection site, as we were told when the vaccine rollout began, that the vaccines, the so-called vaccines, stay in the injection site, well, then the cells that took up these messages would be in your deltoid, and what happens next wouldn't be terribly serious. The problem is we learned very quickly, and should have predicted from the get-go, that they weren't going to stay in the deltoid. All of anything you inject in that space is going to leak out, and it's going to circulate around the body. And here's the problem. Forgive me, this is a little bit technical, I know that, but it involves understanding how immunity naturally develops. So when you become sick, let's say with a virus, some particle has gotten into a cell of yours and it has hijacked it, and it has tricked that cell into producing copies of itself, more viruses, which affect or infect adjacent cells. And if the virus is an effective one, they will also figure out how to jump out of you, like when you cough, and get inhaled by the next person and infect their cells. The body's response to seeing a cell of yours, which it recognizes as yours, that is producing an antigen, that is to say a protein that it doesn't recognize, is to assume that that cell is virally infected.
Yes.
And to destroy it. That is the only correct thing for the body to do when it encounters a cell of yours making foreign protein. Now, this transfection technology, the mRNA vaccine technology, as they called it, does exactly this. It tricks your cells into producing foreign antigens, which the immune system cannot help but recognize as an indicator of infection, and it destroys those cells. If those cells are in the muscle in your arm, not a huge deal. It's not good for you.
You get a sore arm.
You get a sore arm, presumably we might be able to measure a decrease in your strength, but it's not going to shorten your life. However, if these transfection agents circulate around the body, as we know they do, and get taken up haphazardly, then whatever tissue starts producing these foreign proteins is going to be attacked by your immune system.
So you definitely wouldn't want any of this getting near a person's heart or brain.
Definitely not. And very bad if it happens in your brain. It's particularly critical if it happens in your heart, because your heart, for reasons we can go into if you want, has an incredibly low capacity for repair. In fact, your heart doesn't really repair. What it does, you get a wound, if you lose cells from your heart then scars over. And that will affect your heart rhythm, your capacity to transport oxygen and CO2 around the body. It will potentially shorten your life. And it will also create a vulnerability that you won't know that you have.
Until you're like playing soccer or something.
Exactly. So if you imagine somebody has received one of these transfection shots, and especially in the unfortunate case where it has been injected intravenously, which isn't supposed to happen, but the instructions on this shot were not to aspirate the needle. A proper injection should involve pulling back on the plunger in the syringe in order to see if there's blood. If there's blood, that indicates that you've landed in a circulatory vessel and that you should back the needle off or plunge it farther so that you're not injecting it directly into a vein. But in the case of these shots, amazing as this sounds, the advice was don't do that because it requires the needle to be in the person's arm longer, might create extra pain, and they didn't want to create vaccine hesitancy was their excuse. So anyway, you might get a big bolus of this material, and it might flow right through your heart and get taken up by a bunch of cells.
And just for perspective, do we have any guess as to how many of these shots were given out globally?
It's definitely in the billions.
Billions?
Yeah. It's in the
with
billions.
the mRNA technology.
Yes, which is an amazing fact. I mean, in addition to the technology itself being remarkable, the rate at which this was scaled up is positively incredible. Now, it had terrible downsides. I don't know if we'll have time to get to the downsides of the way they scaled up their production on these things. But if we can separate the marvel of what they did, yes, there's an awful lot of stuff here that's beyond wizardry. It's just incredible what they accomplished.
I'm sorry I don't want to take you off track, but you were describing what would happen if it went to various organs, it would damage them. Could it cause cancers too?
We can get back to that. We clearly are seeing an uptick in cancers, and an uptick in cancers that are unusual, especially in their speed. Maybe if we have time, we can come back to the reasons that might be occurring. There's a lot of discussion amongst the medical dissidents about why that pattern exists and what it implies. But yes, clearly cancers are one of the failure modes of the body, and this highly novel technology clearly had that as a risk, even if we didn't know what mechanism it would happen by. But yes, let's say you're a soccer player and you've been injected with this stuff, and a bolus of it has hit your heart and caused a bunch of your cells to be destroyed by your own immune system, by cytotoxic T cells and natural killer cells. Well, now you've got a wound. If you manage to survive to have it scar over, then that wound will be less of a vulnerability than it would otherwise be. But if in the period after you've been damaged, before your heart has fully scarred, you were to push yourself to some new athletic limit, let's say you're in the middle of a particularly intense game, right? That would be exactly the time when a weakness in a vessel wall might cause a critical failure, and you could die on the field. So this is a very plausible mechanism to explain the pattern of sudden deaths that we have seen oftentimes in people who are unusually healthy and athletic.
Yes.
So to go back to the original story, pharma had a potentially tremendously lucrative property that it couldn't bring to market because a safety test would have revealed this unsolvable problem at its heart. And so what I'm wondering, my hypothesis, is that it recognized that the thing that would bypass that obstacle was an emergency that caused the public to demand a remedy to allow them to go back to work and to living their lives, that would cause the government to streamline the safety testing process so that it wouldn't spot these things. And indeed, one of the things that we see, in addition to a lot more harm in those safety tests than we were initially allowed to understand, but also the safety testing was radically truncated so that long-term harms were impossible to detect. So the hypothesis in question is pharma used an emergency to bypass an obstacle to bring an incredibly lucrative technology to normalize it in the public, in the regulatory apparatus, to sneak it by the things that would ordinarily prevent a dangerous technology like this one from being widely deployed.